Welcome back to the Faith Roots podcast, and we're continuing our look at 1 Chronicles. In fact, we're coming to the end of 1 Chronicles, and next time we're going to go into 2nd Chronicles. We're coming to the end of the life and the reign of King David, and next time we will be picking up with the start of the reign of Solomon as we move into the second book. So, as I said, David is coming to the end of his reign and the end of his life. One of the important things that we've discovered is that God has revealed to him that despite his own personal desires, he is not the one who is going to build a house for God. There seem to be two aspects to that. The first is that somebody else is going to build a physical house, a temple, but also that God is more established with, God is more concerned with establishing a house, a household, an eternal reign for David and his descendants. And one of the questions that we have at this stage in Chronicles is how is that going to be fulfilled? But the other question that we might have is how did David respond? There would have no doubt been a lot of disappointment, and this could have caused resentment and bitterness, a reaction that God doesn't really love him, that God doesn't really appreciate him, that God doesn't approve of him. But that's not what we see. And as we look at these last few chapters, chapter 22 through to chapter 29, that's a big read for you, a lot to cover here. That as we read them, we see David's response, and it's positive. So, first of all, in chapter 22, verse 2 to 4, we see that David starts to make preparations. He decides that although he's not going to be the one to build a temple, to build the house of the Lord, he's going to help get ready for it. He's going to make sure that his son Solomon is well equipped, well supported, and is in good stead when he comes around to building this temple, that he's going to be able to do it early in his reign, that this is going to be one of his priorities and maybe even his life project. So David arranges for people and for materials. If you look at verse 2 to 4, he gives orders and he calls together the foreigners, the sojourners that are living in Israel. And he gives them the job of preparing stone for the buildings. Now, there could be a positive aspect to that, a sense of the inclusion of everybody in the land, that this is something that all can be involved in. There may be some side application there about how we involve and use people that get involved and come along to church even before they are believers. That might be something you want to debate and discuss amongst your church leaders. There may be a risk here as well that these foreigners could be being conscripted in, that David could be starting to acquire slaves, and that is certainly something that we begin to see under Solomon's reign and beyond, the sense of force of conscripted labour that even extends to the Israelites themselves. So some positives, but also some risks. Verse 5 to 16, he commissions his son Solomon. Notice that he's concerned about Solomon's inexperience, that he's going to come to the throne young and he won't have all of that experience. This is something that Solomon himself will be concerned about. And you will notice that there is a kind of tie-up, a relationship between these last chapters of 1 Chronicles and Solomon's own description of his circumstances, of his inexperience, and of what he's been commissioned to do when you go back to 1 Kings and the early chapters of 1 Kings. So David is concerned about Solomon's inexperience. Again, some positives there. This is driving this desire to prepare, to help Solomon get ready, to give him a good start. There could be the risk here of being the sort of the helicopter parent who is so concerned to do everything for his son. So that's a balance that David will need to keep. David's main concern is for God's glory here. He wants the house to be magnificent, even though he can't build it. He wants it to be glorious and wonderful. He wants the project to succeed. David, when he speaks to Solomon and commissions him, he will also give some extra detail that's not reported in the original prophetic word for him. That one of the reasons why he's not to build this house, this is something that Solomon himself will pick up and explain in 1 Kings 5 verse 3 to 5, is that he has been a man of war. He's been busy fighting battles. He's got blood on his hands. And so God has said that the person who builds the temple will be a man of peace. Something important about his character is he's building this house of peace. And perhaps as well, just the practicalities of David has been so busy establishing the kingdom's borders, defending the people, defeating enemies, that there simply hasn't been time for this important project. We might even think here, just on a little side note, about the pattern of Sabbath rest. That Sabbath is a season of the work that we've been doing in order to rest by giving our attention to worship, resting in God and enjoying Him. That's a little side point. So David arranges for resources, commissions Solomon, and then thirdly, in this chapter, still in chapter 22, verse 17 to 24, verse 17 onwards to 20. I got my tongue in the right twist there. So from chapter 22, verse 17 through to the end of that chapter, and then on to chapter 27 and verse 34. So all of these next few chapters show David arranging for help, calling for people to come and to help. And notice at the end of this chapter that they are to come and help in response to God blessing them. God has made their borders safe. God has given them rest. And so they should help their king, David's successor. They should help Solomon in this great project. And then through these next few chapters, we've got lists of names again, just as we had at the start of the book. All of the people, the priests, those that are going to be involved in leading worship, in making music, the duties of the musicians, chapter 25, and all that are going to be involved in that. The duties of the gatekeepers, chapter 26. So all of these people who have a part to play in the temple and in its building. Chapter 27, military commanders and divisions, so the responsibility of those that are going to be involved in protecting this project and protecting the temple to make sure that peace will continue so that the temple can be built and protected and the people can worship in safety. And then we come to chapter 28. Yeah, that David makes his plans and he communicates them. And this is both his instructions to Solomon, but also to the people as well. And you'll notice as you read this chapter that there are echoes of when Moses hands over to Joshua and when Joshua hands over as the people enter the land. Look particularly at verse 8, chapter 28, verse 8. So now with God as our witness and in the sight of all Israel, the Lord's assembly, I give you this charge. Be careful to obey all of the commands of the Lord your God so that you may continue to possess this good land and leave it to your children as a permanent inheritance. That sense that David is the new Moses, is the new Joshua, that Solomon will now be the new Joshua. This handing on of the baton to that next generation. All of them in this line pointing forward to Jesus. Chapter 29, verse 1 to 9, there are practicalities. Just as at the start, we've seen that he's made sure that there are resources, people, stone, metal, all of the things that they will need, so people and materials. So he makes sure that the finances are available by encouraging people to give to the work. But although there's this sense of David preparing, although there's this sense of asking people to help by working, by giving, by coming, David recognizes that unless the Lord builds the house, the people labor in vain. And so the most important thing he does is in verse 10 to in 29, verse 10 to 20, he prays. Two aspects to that prayer. First of all, the recognition that the glory belongs to God. So the purpose of this act, of this project, is to give glory and worship and praise to the one who deserves all honor and glory and majesty and power. And secondly, because not only does he deserve it, but because he has it even without our praise. So power and honor and glory and goodness belong to God and come from God. God is the one who gives good gifts to his people. And in chapter 29, verse 21 to 25, David again affirms and confirms Solomon as his successor. Not an issue of in 1 Chronicles, but in 2 Samuel and in 1 Kings, it's clear that that succession is not certain, that it is contested and disputed. And then in chapter 29, verse 26 to 30, there is that sense that David is now ready to go home to be with his Lord, that this is something to look forward to. He died at a ripe old age, having enjoyed long life, wealth, and honour. Then his son Solomon ruled in his place. There's that right balance of enjoying life now, including that eye on the next generation, on the legacy, but being ready to go home when the Lord calls us. So I want to suggest that there are some practical lessons here. First of all, the thing not just about life now and the work of the gospel and the ministry of our local church here and now. It's important to be doing those things, but we want to think long term. We should be ready for the Lord to return today, but also prepared for him to tarry, for him to wait longer. So we should act as though Jesus could come back at any moment, but at the same time prepare people for the long haul, that it could be another 100 years, another 1,000 years. We don't know. We should be thinking, what if the church that we are involved in leading, that we are part of, continues for another 100, another 200, another 500, another 1,000 years? What are our responsibilities to the future? How do we prepare for that future? How do we get ready to hand over? That means that we will invest in future leaders, that we will train up and equip new leaders. We won't be waiting to hand the baton on to one person when we retire or die. But it's now. That there should be continuous dependence and trust and faith in God, not just for what is going on now, but for the future as well. And it means that we should hold lightly to life here, enjoy it, take seriously the calling that God has given to us, but at the same time don't take ourselves too seriously. Life here, hold tightly to eternal hope. So some practical lessons, and that might be something that you want to pause and discuss with others. How has God called you? What part has God played us to play in the building of his kingdom, thinking particularly of your present church? Then what responsibilities do you have, and how can you help prepare your church and those that come after you for the future? Maybe spend a bit of time talking about those questions. You can pause the talk and then return to these last points here, because there are some practical lessons, but also some big picture ones. The big picture, right here, even at the end of 1 Chronicles, is that the chronicler puts the focus on the temple, that this is the end goal of everything that David has been working towards. And David's life work was about God being honoured and glorified, and ensuring that God's people were in God's presence under God's provision. Now, this brings us back again to that bigger vision of the house that God was preparing and has prepared in the coming of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. And reminds us of our place in that vision as well. Old Testament will present this picture of a house for God, a temple that is not one built with human hands, not an earthly temple. It is the picture of what God is doing, building his church, pointing us forward to the return of Christ when his eternal reign of peace will be established. Listening in, I hope you've enjoyed 1 Chronicles. I hope that's encouraged you to get into this particular book of the Bible. Maybe if you're responsible for preaching and teaching or leading Bible studies in your church, it's encouraged you to say, why don't we do a teaching series on 1 Chronicles or a similar book from the Old Testament? We'll be back again, and we are going to go into 2 Chronicles to give us a bit more of the history of God's people through Solomon's reign up until the exile.